Dr. Sharma, um, my understanding is that Hinduism features duties, personal duties, pretty strongly. And I was wondering if there was room for rights in particular, or in general, in Hindu thought, and in particular human rights.
Yeah, thanks, Matilda, for asking that question, because it is extremely relevant to the Hindu way of life. The emphasis on duties, which you mentioned earlier, is of course very salutary morally, and maybe even not just salutary but morally elevating. But there lurks a very serious danger within it. The danger is that someone unscrupulously disposed can use, or rather exploit, that commitment to right, I beg your pardon, the commitment to duty on the part of a person, either because of the person's own commitment to it or because of the society's commitment to it. An unscrupulous person can exploit and abuse this commitment by turning the discourse back onto right, from rights to duties, when somebody claims their rights. I'll give you a simple example from the academia. If a student comes to me and asks me some questions about what I have taught, and I don't want to answer them, which is my duty, then I might say that why don't you go and read this part of a book up and do your duty as a student. I'm using the other person's desire, willingness to do his or her duty as a way of not honoring that person's rightful claim on me. The claim on me as a right by the student that I explain what I discuss in the class. You can see that in a culture oriented towards duty, this is an easy trap to fall in and hard to get out of if your thinking is always in terms of duty discourse. So your question is a very important one. But the assumption that Hinduism does not possess a rights discourse as distinguished from a duties discourse, either explicitly or implicitly, is also a very profound misconception. And let me explain how one can argue in this way. Normally, somebody's rights imply somebody's duty to fulfill them. If you have the right to medical treatment, then it's the duty of the medical establishment to provide that right. In other words, rights and duties discourses are deeply correlated. So when you find this emphasis in Asian religions, in general as it is claimed, and Hinduism in particular it is claimed, that duty discourse dominates the moral vision. What does it really mean? It really means that according to Hinduism, I am encouraged to give priority to the moral claims of others on me. Those moral claims are their rights, and my duty is my way of responding to them. Am I making sense? Yeah. So that when any discourse emphasizes duties, it does not mean that it does not have an idea of rights. Rather, it is making a moral judgment about the relative prioritization of rights. So when it says that you should do your duty, it is saying that you should give priority to the rights that others have on you, to the rights you have on them. So it does not mean that the discourse lacks the concept of rights. Then what is the difference between Hinduism and the West in this sense, the discourse of human rights? Well, the difference really turns out to be that because the West emphasizes rights discourse, it emphasizes or gives priority to the claims I have on others. Whereas Hindu moral discourse gives priority to the claims that others have on me. So I think they should level the field, playing field. It is not that one discourse has no appreciation of the other, that is, one has only duties and one has only rights. Because rights and duties are so closely intertwined, it becomes clear upon a little reflection that the reality of the issue is which set of rights, whose rights are to be prioritized.
Dr. Sharma, now that you've clarified that for me, I was wondering if I could push you a little bit further on how Hinduism provides for human rights.
Well, I think it does so by emphasizing that everybody should do their duty. If everybody does their duty, then everybody's moral claims are met. Everybody's moral claims on the other are implicitly met without having to take recourse to rights discourse. If it is my duty as a teacher to teach, which is the right of the student to be taught by me, and it is the duty of the student, it is my right to demand certain responses, pedagogical responses from the student. If he does his duty, my right is met. If I do my duty, his or her right is met. So if either of these discourses, rights or duties, is properly enforced or inculcated, then everybody's rights and duties will be met. So the question, however, then arises, what if this ideal state of affairs does not prevail? Then we have to keep in mind the danger implicit in rights discourse and duty discourse. The danger implicit in duty discourse is the neglect of rights.
Mm.
And the danger implicit in rights discourse is the neglect of duty. So that is where our attention should be.
Mm. But given the emphasis that Hinduism has on duty, are there any explicit references to rights in Hinduism?
A very good question, yeah. There is a very interesting passage in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad where it is stated that a weaker person overcomes a stronger person in a court of law on account of dharma. The word used is dharma. And that word dharma is usually translated as duty. But I would like to suggest that in this context, its proper sense is right. The weaker person overcomes the stronger person on the basis of his or her right. Dharma.
Mm.
The semantic problem here is that the same word is being used according to the context to do duty for right, if you will forgive my use of the word, and for duty. And this happens in sometimes. For instance, the word minister can refer to a minister of a church and a minister in a cabinet. And it's only the context which allows us to get the right sense. In this reference which I mentioned, there is a very interesting comment on this part of the text by a very well-known exegete in the Hindu tradition called Shankara. And he says clearly in his commentary that dharma was created out of the fear of the arbitrary exercise of power by the ruler, which is the root conception of rights. So it is clear that Hindu thought, properly contextualized, has references both to duty discourse and rights discourse. It has had a long history, and it is quite possible that in some phases rights discourse was overpowered by duty discourse or vice versa.
Are there instances where people have exercised their rights in Hinduism?
In this sense, yes. There is a very well-known account of the kings of Kashmir, very much in the news these days, but for wrong reasons. This history of Kashmir was composed in the 12th century by someone called Kalhana. And it's a history. One of the few histories in Sanskrit literature. It contains an account of a king in the 8th century called Chandrapid. And this king wants to build a temple. And preparations have reached a fairly advanced stage when it is discovered that a hamlet belonging to an untouchable falls within the area planned for this temple. So when this point is brought to the king tells his courtiers, why didn't you point this out earlier? Do you think I'm going to build a temple on the size of my subjects? So there's an impasse. And ultimately the impasse is resolved when the untouchable sends a message to the king. And the king goes to see him and they negotiate a settlement. Clearly this implies the recognition of the right of this individual to his property. The recognition of the right both by the king and by the individual. And the resolution of the problem created by the king's plans. By the presence of the hamlet. For the hamlet by the king's plans, and for the king's plans by the hamlet. There's an even more interesting from the 12th century, case from the 12th century. And this one is from Gujarat. Apparently from a place called Dholka. And I mention the name because it is a part of central Gujarat. And the incident belongs to the reign of one very well-known Gujarati king called Siddharaj. The mother of Siddharaj, while going on a pilgrimage, noticed that the people passing through this area had felt a great difficulty in gaining access to water. So when she shared this situation with the king wanted to build a lake there, a circular lake. But to complete the circle, they had to pass through a widow's hamlet. The widow refused to yield her land. And so there is a bump in the circle around the land which she refused to give. All this is a clear recognition of the right of humble people like a widow, in the earlier case an untouchable, to their possessions. And by the king, in one case the king has forced to negotiate, and in the other case the widow refused to yield. And his plans had to be altered to accommodate her desire. So I think it's clear then that both theoretically and historically there is ample scope for rights. In Hindu ethical discourse, while it is true, while it remains a fact that given Hinduism's ethos, ethical ethos, it likes to prioritize the rights others have on us in the form of duties, to the claims we may have on them.